Howdy mates, good afternoon. Here's a part 3 video over by the Charlotte Harbor, which is where we technically are, near Port Charlotte. Today we're taking another break at a different spot, and as you can see right now the water is a lot lower than it normally is. That's just because of tidal fluctuations. So like right now it is in a little bit of low tide at the moment. But then you figure in the next few hours, this will all most likely get covered again. But you can see now the illustration of sand ripples. And I figured this was now a good time to really talk about it. So sand ripples really indicate how the water is behaving. So typically, when you look at any sand ripple, here's one thing that you need to keep in mind is when you go to an individual ridge right here, usually towards the crest of the ripple, that's where you will typically find more of the larger and more coarse sediments. But then the further away you get from the crest, so as it enters into a trough, that's when it becomes finer sediment. And I believe it behaves that way because the larger minerals are the last to suspend. And that's why typically everything else will form around those larger sediments. But technically where we are standing is something called an intertidal zone. Now, typically intertidal zones are associated with the oceans, but every now and then you will even see it along a harbor as well. Now you may be wondering, what exactly do I mean by an intertidal zone? Well, think of it this way. It's a zone that is always changing. And what I mean by that is what's always changing is the water levels. So like right now, since it is a little bit of low tide, we're able to walk on this just fine. But then, as it gets most likely in the next few hours, closer to nighttime, the moon is out, the tide will begin to rise. And it's quite amazing how tides are really controlled by the gravitational pull of our moon. Remarkable, isn't it? But typically in these intertidal zones, they're actually considered to be one of the more biodiverse types of communities. Even though we really don't see it here, it's still happening. Oftentimes, in an intertidal zone, there are only a select few types of organisms that can survive. Because here's the thing. The organisms, they have to have that capability of handling both being underwater and even being above water. So they have to adapt very accordingly. Now, with that being said, in an intertidal zone, that's usually one of the most sought after places by wildlife, especially when it comes to wading birds, from land, and then the fishes from underwater. So they're literally any of the organisms that inhabit intertidal zones, they're facing competition from two different fronts. So typically, in situations like this, they'll try to burrow themselves into the sand so that they become harder to find. But here's another kicker. Excuse me. Wading birds, such as that of roseate spoonbills and white ibis, what they'll do is they have these beaks that actually allow them to dig into the sand quite easily, as a matter of fact. Now, they won't find every single organism because there are most likely thousands of them where I'm standing. Some of these organisms can include snails, just as a broad example, horseshoe crabs, and even oysters. Oysters seem to be the most common, especially over here. Because I'm actually walking towards it right now. You see these red mangroves? They actually have oysters, especially as you reach towards the bottom of the prop roots. Hold on just a second. There we go. I had to move my kayak. It was starting to float away. But look at this. We're seeing a bunch of oysters. So typically what they have to do is they have to hold in any of the water that they may have had the chance to collect before the water levels dropped. That's what really enables their survival. And they know that. But look at this right here. Isn't that cool or what? And even barnacles, too, have that same adaptability. But these guys are all filter feeders that happen in this water. So typically, this is something I've mentioned before, the artificial mini reefs that I have helped install with Garrett Stewart from the Eco Preservation Project. The artificial mini reefs, in a way, imitate exactly what happens in a mangrove prop root system. But that is an amazing thing about intertidal zones, is that they're always changing, and only a select few organisms can actually inhabit them. I'm actually gonna hold on a second, you guys. Now, oftentimes, you'll even notice, especially in the Charlotte Harbor, we even have a horseshoe crab right here. Now, I'm under the impression that this was in the process of molting, I think. Thing is, what's neat about horseshoe crabs is that they're not even true crabs. They're actually more closely related to arachnids. They're also known as decapods. Well, hold on a second. No. They are still more closely related to arachnids, despite even being called a horseshoe crab. Now, what's even more deceiving, too, is they even have 10 limbs. That would remind you of a crab, because most crabs are decapods. But a neat thing about horseshoe crabs is they have a capability of something called molting. So that means they have that ability to basically, as they grow, they produce a new shell or outer covering, exoskeleton, that covers their body. And they're like a very complex shape, too. What's neat about the horseshoe crab in particular is they actually have a useful trait. So their blood is typically blue. And what's neat is their blood has actually been used in the medical field. The blood has actually been used as a tracer. So what I mean by that is they'll use their blood to trace if there's a problem in medical equipment, if it's not working properly. It helps indicate if something's wrong. Now, with that being said, you may be wondering, like, is it really sustainable, especially for the horseshoe crab? Well, typically what happens is the blood is collected in a humanely manner, but they obviously don't take all of it. And usually most horseshoe crabs are returned back into the wild. But it's just so unique how their blood is blue. But oftentimes in these types of ecosystems, you'll find plenty of horseshoe crabs. I actually did a video on them not too long ago. Well, it was actually a couple of months ago, where it actually went a bit more in depth about the horseshoe crab itself. So, alright you guys, I think that should wrap up the video. Thanks for watching, and once again, Journey on a Journey is outwards. Take care, folks. See ya.